Hello, everybody. We're just going to give you a minute or two while everybody comes into the webinar, and then we'll make a start. Right, we still have a few people coming in, so just a couple more seconds. Okay, I'll make a start. Good morning and midday to all of you. A very warm welcome to this IETA live webinar. IETA live webinars are open to all, so it's really great to see such a cross-section of industry joining us today. Really super to see you joining alongside of many of our IETA members. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available at IETA.org in a few days' time. You're very welcome to access it there. For those of you who don't know, haven't met IETA, we're a membership-based organization, a not-for-profit organization. And in terms of membership, we have well over 300 members representing all aspects of the carbon market, from buyers to project developers to service providers, really every aspect of the carbon market. And that's what makes for such great conversations in IETA, because the participation is really very representative. Our role is to track carbon markets globally and to look at how we advocate for best practice, and that includes writing position papers, responding to consultations, and having many dialogues with carbon market participants. So this webinar, the focus of this webinar today is on something we don't cover actually that much, which is research and studies that have been conducted in the last year or so on the demand side of the voluntary carbon market. And as much as we can in IETA, we try and refer to data and facts. And other than IETA, I think probably all the panel today have exactly the same or come from the same perspective, that the more we can rely on data and facts to inform our approaches, to inform our position papers, the better. But very often we come up with a sort of summary or the outputs of those position papers or a high-level executive summary, and we don't really dig in to the nitty-gritty. And that's important because there's a lot of resource that goes into it. There's a lot of data tracking that has to happen in order for us to really assimilate and understand trends, to form positions on where the market could be going. So it's really important work that gets done and is quite often a bit behind the scenes. We'll be covering 5 reports today, so it's quite a lot, but of course it's not the universe of reports. There's lots coming out all the time. And in fact, just this morning, I was reading the new one by We Mean Business, which is more of a survey, but again, looking at how the use of carbon markets catalyzes action. And we'll be hearing lots more of that today. So of course we can never do these studies justice as we look at them today, because they are each of them a mini book in itself. But we're going to give you a good overview, and hopefully enough that if it's something you're interested in, you can dig in further and go and read the full reports. We will be providing you the links to the report so you'll know where you can find them. I guess maybe just also to remind everyone that these are modeling reports. So primarily they're based on a core data sample and then extrapolated to get a sort of perspective of the world that's relevant and helpful as we try and understand the opportunities around voluntary carbon market. So by definition, they're never exact. And we should really think about the outputs that we're going to go through today in that context. Finally, I'd also like to just let you know about some new guidelines that IETA is bringing out. These guidelines are built on one of the studies that you're going to be taken through today, the one that AlliedOffsets has produced. These guidelines look at the high integrity use of carbon credits in support of net zero. They build on great work, the VCMI work, they build on the net zero, the Oxford Net Zero Principles work, but they look at taking a slight additional use case to what those papers represent. So it'll be interesting to get people's views on those. The guidelines will be launched in April, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those as we get towards the end of the session. So let me move now to introduce you to our panel. So I'll start with myself. I'm Andrea Abrahams. I'm the Managing Director of the Voluntary Carbon Market at IETA, and I'll be moderating your session today. We have Mark Kenber, Executive Director of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, Stephen Donofrio, who was formerly Managing Director at Ecosystem Marketplace, Antonia Drummond, Carbon Market Data Lead for AlliedOffsets, and James Griffiths, Head of Corporate Data at MSCI and previously with Trove. So a great panel, all representing work that has been done across these studies. If we move on to the next slide then, what I just wanted to highlight is the format that we'll be going through today. So it is an hour-and-a-half session. It will be packed. We'll start off with an introduction and some context setting by Mark. We then have 3 presentations. Stephen will start, and Stephen covers 3 papers in his presentation. Thereafter, Antonia and James. Hold your horses, don't rush off after that, because we then have an opportunity to do some questions and answers. Please put any questions into the Q&A chat down at the bottom, not the one that says chat, but the one that says Q&A. We will try and address those as we go, but we will also look at and accumulate some of the questions to address in the Q&A chat. If there's time, we'll also take some of them in person. And then very finally, right at the end, we would like to share with you a piece of work that we've all done together. It's very simple, but it's taken us quite some time, and that's to summarize some key takeouts from all of these studies that we've all been involved in. And we hope that you'll find it as useful as we have to try and kind of assimilate across all this work a couple of key points, key data points that we can all agree on. So that's, we'll end the session on that. On your right-hand side is a link, the QR code, which takes you to where all the studies can be found. So on that note, I am going to get right into it, and we will start with Mark. And Mark, if you could give us your opening comments, please.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And also thank you to IETA for inviting me to be here this afternoon. Welcome, everybody. So just to provide a little bit of context, we currently face a series of challenges in terms of the climate. We are off track. We all know this. We are off track with where emissions should be. From the Paris Agreement, if we wanted to get on a pathway that keeps global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, we should be reducing emissions by 42% by 2030. Currently, we're on track for a 3% increase, we haven't even yet peaked global emissions. So there is a huge amount of work to do to get our global emissions back on track. We know also that for developing countries who are going to obviously play a huge role in the net zero transition, for them to be able to meet their NDCs and increase the ambition of their NDCs in the future, remember these are next round of NDCs are due next year in 2025, it's estimated that climate finance to support the net zero transition needs to be at 2 trillion by 2030. That's 5 times the flows of climate finance currently. So big emissions gap, big financing gap. We know also that there are many, many opportunities to reduce emissions. Bottom-up assessment has suggested that through carbon finance and other sources of finance, there are potentially 8 to 10 gigatons of emission reduction and removal opportunities. Now, not all of that obviously will be financed through the voluntary carbon markets, although voluntary carbon markets can play a role in scaling up and leveraging other sources of finance. But just put that in perspective, 8 to 10 gigatons of opportunities per year by 2030. Currently, the carbon market, voluntary carbon market, is around 250 million tons. So huge potential to scale up if it's done well and with integrity. And beyond that, we also know that when we get to net zero in mid-century, we are going to need a huge volume of long duration emissions removals. That market at the moment is tiny and high price. So we need investment through carbon markets and other sources to bring the cost of removals down. So we have this challenge. We need to reduce emissions. We need more money. We have a carbon market or voluntary carbon market that is not yet fulfilling its full potential. So there's a key question that we need to answer. Given that we need both corporates to decarbonize rapidly, we're going to hear from the presenters later on in this session that many companies are not yet on track for their targets, and that's the small group that have set targets. So we need to drive decarbonization, but we also need to drive much more investment through voluntary carbon markets. So the question we need to ask ourselves, how can we have both and? How do we incentivize that decarbonization and also incentivize investments in voluntary and other carbon markets in a way that they mutually reinforce each other rather than being seen, as many believe, perhaps erroneously, that one cannibalizes the other? I think the evidence we're going to hear later today will give some insights into how we might do that. VCMI operates to enable high integrity carbon markets, and our demand side work, which you will have seen in the code of practice claims code of practice that we published last year, and the 3 carbon integrity claims that companies can already make, seeks to answer precisely those questions. How and when can companies credibly and with high integrity voluntarily engage with carbon markets? And importantly, what can they credibly say about that? The claims. Those carbon integrity claims are for those companies who are already able to go above and beyond their targets. But as we're going to hear today, there is a whole lot more scope to expand that investment, expand the role of carbon markets, and in so doing, drive more corporate ambition. So with that, Andrea, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Mark. I love that positive tone at the end there. And that's really great to set up our first speaker, who, again, I think Stephen overall has actually got a really positive message. So Stephen, if you would like to start with presentation 1.
Great. Thanks for that, Mark, and thank you, Andrea. IETA and ICROA, it's great to be here for the second of these 2 webinars with the fellow panelists. As Andrea mentioned, I'm recently from Ecosystem Marketplace, and now as an independent, I have the luxury of being able to speak about other people's incredible research in addition to the work that I led while I was at Ecosystem Marketplace. I think a couple, maybe 2 or 3 key points that I'd just like to highlight as an introduction to this, which is that I've been involved in carbon markets for almost 2 decades personally, and have seen the evolution of this market go from a very niche space where not many people really knew about it to now what we're seeing is a mainstreaming of the voluntary carbon market. And in that time, have also seen corporate sustainability go from a very niche practice within environmental health and safety departments or marketing departments of companies to now being part of the mainstream within corporate landscapes. There's a lot of evidence and interesting research out there showing the trajectory that companies are on just in the last few years on core metrics around reporting greenhouse gas emissions, the number of companies increasing to do that, and what that means, for preparedness for mandatory or more compliance-based ESG sustainability reporting. There's a really, I think, an important couple pieces of commentary about the report that Andrea alluded to from We Mean Business, Intercontinental Exchange and Bain that just got published. And it's very much a follow-up to the 3 reports that I'll be talking about today. But what they did was surveyed about 180 different senior executives from 27 countries across different sectors to look at the kind of the sentiments around the voluntary carbon market and whether or not the VCM is an enabler or a disabler of corporate action. And generally what it found is that it is an enabler and it allows companies to go further, faster. So I think that's really important that this is coming directly from the mouths of corporate executives. And there's a very important piece in there that talks about the 5 reasons that companies are not investing in VCM or not engaging with the VCM. And interestingly, things that are at the potentially get highlighted more by media, such as lawsuits or legal ramifications, that was not in the top 5. They were all very solvable components about recognizing the actions companies are taking by standards such as VCMI, the civil society, media, better clarity about the quality of credits and quality, so the project attributes, which we're seeing with the Integrity Council and ratings agencies and other things that talk about how companies can account for these carbon purchases within their greenhouse gas emissions portfolio and climate action strategies. So I think what I'll do is just get into the slides here, but I wanted to make sure that was mentioned. It's not a part of the core of these 3 reports, but it is very important. So basically, Forest Trends and the report that we published, which we'll talk about in addition to the reports from Silvera and Trove, there's a fundamental question that we're all trying to ask and try to understand and have clear evidence one way or the other. It is really about how companies are not utilizing the voluntary carbon market and the ability to purchase credits to compensate, for unavoidable emissions or emissions that are too costly, to invest in the direct operations today, but are part of a longer term strategy, for the corporate to address over time. And there's a few buckets within that we tend to all look at, and roughly speaking, we think about, how is decarbonization or emissions performance affected? So that's really the first question. But in order to get there, we need to understand how is disclosure correlated, or is there a link between greater transparency from corporations and investment into the voluntary carbon market? And then within that, there are very different ways that different sectors, based on their science-based pathways or Paris-aligned pathways, they can work towards achieving those greenhouse gas reductions within the value chain. And that also then leads to different opportunities for those different sectors for purchasing carbon credits as a part of their strategies. And some of these reports have excluded certain sectors. For example, the Trove report excluded oil and gas from their analysis. In some cases, the Ecosystem Marketplace report did the same when we looked at science-based targets. So there's a need to really get into the weeds and some of the data and the details of the methodology. And then the last one here is around that project and credit preferences. And it's not just the general project categories, but it boils down to the location of those credits, where they're coming from, those projects and the origination. Vintages, so the antiquity of those credits, as well as other things that might have to do with sustainable development goals or other attributes that are beyond carbon. I'll try to click here to the next slide. Okay. So these are the three reports. I mentioned them. The banner on this slide is that at the end of the day, they all generally found the same thing. And we'll talk about the differences of their data sets and their approaches in a moment. But ultimately, what we found was that these three reports that were developed independently from each other, using distinct different approaches and sometimes similar data sets, but not always the same data sets, found that companies that are purchasing carbon credits from the voluntary carbon market are doing more to decarbonize and are going faster in some cases to decarbonize than the companies that are not buying carbon credits. So that's a very general statement. So that's why these reports provide clarity when they investigate the information on sector-based, project type-based, and different criteria. But that I think is really important, that we understand that there is that harmonization between these three publications. The next slide, please. So before jumping into those three reports, I think what might not be super clear to folks is that this data doesn't exist in one nicely packaged, bundled way. So the primary and probably I think the first place that a lot of us would go to are the first two here, the disclosure statements from companies, whether it's through third-party managed solutions like the Carbon Disclosure Project, now called CDP, and the Climate Change Questionnaire. There is a specific question that asks the companies who are disclosing, are you originating or procuring credits from project-based carbon offsets or carbon projects? Then we'll look at websites, sustainability reports to understand how they're publicizing, their investments, their purchases, or their engagement with projects and project opponents. But also in the recent years, the different standards such as Verra, Gold Standard, ACR, CAR, and others have included a column in the retirements page of their registries that indicates who the retirement beneficiary is, or the retiree. That isn't a required field necessarily, so you don't always get that answer, and if you do, it may not always give you the end user, but it is a valuable resource, although it does require a lot of cleaning and a lot of organization in order for it to be fully usable. And then and I think what these organizations have all done is put together their own databases, whether it's from those first two, or for example, coming from Ecosystem Marketplace, we have sellers reporting to us their sales, and they would also disclose who their buyers were. That's confidential data, so that's not something that would be usable, off, immediately. But there is a way to kind of understand that data, generalize it, and anonymize it. So it is valuable to think about how the different organizations can find those resources. So now I'll just talk about these different reports, and I won't be able to go deep dive, of course, into each of them, but the opportunity here is just to get a little bit of a renewed flavor from them and be able to go back to these reports. And I think the hope here is that this research, whether it's independently, it's together, it all can continue, because we need to continue to see the evidence to show what these reports have found, and that generally it is good news. That looking here at the Silvera report, that was really the first in this sequence last year of reports on corporations, and based on their disclosure data, largely from, I believe, CDP, that this was a composite of 9 years of data, 2013 to 2021. It was a relatively focused sample set of 102 total companies. 51 are corporate users, but there was each of these have their own kind of methodology about how a user was defined or what that sample was defined as. So for Silvera, it was based on which companies retired the most credits, and also had the highest revenue by sector. So here, I think the takeaway is very clear that the companies that are buying and using carbon credits are reducing their scope 1 and 2 emissions at a greater percentage than the companies that are not buying carbon credits. And that really equals almost a 2x rate of investment in emission reductions from those companies buying carbon credits. So that is a kind of a key highlight that is very consistent, that's showing that the companies investing in carbon credits and buying carbon credits for their own use, that is not detracting investment, that would otherwise have gone into emission reduction activities within the value chain, but it is additional, and it's almost showing a very clear linkage between that greater investment into reductions of their own emissions and the reductions outside through carbon projects. And then the last point here, which is also consistent, we'll see it again in the next 2 slides, is that the different sectors have different rates, and typically the services services sectors were found as the leaders when it comes to decarbonization and achieving climate goals, or setting key climate metrics in place in addition to carbon credit purchasing. Whereas certain sectors like manufacturing and technology were the laggards from the Silvera report. So the next slide here. So this report came out in mid last year from Trove, which is now MSCI, and we have a panelist here talking about another report that they published later in the year. But this report looked at a very similar scope, although a wider net of companies, just over 4,000 companies in 6 years of data. Then they landed on just over 350 companies that were termed users of carbon credits based on a materiality definition, which meant that they needed to be buying at least 100 metric tons of credits, and also aligning to at least 5% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So again, you'll see here on the right side that percentage in the percentage of companies and the kind of the pace of which companies that are buying carbon credits are decarbonizing and reducing their emissions is greater than those companies that are not buying carbon credits. And it also, the report very interestingly looked at, and this is just a sampling, but looked at heavier users of credits versus lighter users, and found that those companies that were kind of more engaged in the voluntary carbon market, for lack of a better term or way of describing it, are actually decarbonizing faster than those that are just dipping their toe in. And then I think it's also kind of important to kind of indicate that Trove does a really great job of identifying their own criteria for kind of placing labels or their own criteria of quality for projects and credits. And they also have tools that have been developed for price forecasting. And so they were able to also identify that those credits that have higher quality and higher integrity and price components, those companies that are buying those credits are reducing emissions more quickly than the ones buying the lower integrity and lower price credits. So much more in that report also to go into, but I'll leave it there for now. And then the final report, which I led the authoring of while I was at Ecosystem Marketplace, was we looked at 1 year of data from CDP, although it's really more than that in some of the metrics when we investigated the emissions direction of change, for example. So this is data disclosed to CDP in 2022, looking at the previous years roughly of data 2021, although it did also include previous year emissions data. And a large data set here from all the companies disclosed to CDP in 2022, just under 800 companies were found to be users of credits. We excluded originators only because it was unclear if they were also using those credits or just originating for sale. So there are some challenges with the data set. So to be conservative, we excluded, certain companies. We presented the data a little bit differently, but ultimately found very similar results. And we also looked, because we looked at the full data set, we were able to go into a lot of different nooks and crannies around accountability, transparency, ambition, and action. So all of those building blocks in order to get to the point where we can determine whether or not companies are achieving their goals or are falling behind. And across the board found that companies that are buying carbon credits for their use, as we can understand it, are doing more around disclosure of emissions. So the transparency side, they're doing more around having an approved science-based target, doing more to engage their value chains and reporting on Scope 3 emissions. And then really getting to the core of this is that they are spending more on decreasing their emissions footprint within their value chain, and are more likely to be decarbonizing year over year. So again, similar components here, but some of these reports go deeper in some areas than others. And it's really important to kind of put them together and use them as a nice package. So I think I'll leave it there. I appreciate the opportunity to take time to go through those, and happy to answer questions in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. Really fascinating. 3 independent studies done by different organizations, looking at the correlation between corporate ambition and voluntary carbon markets, and coming up with very similar conclusions. So really fascinating. If anyone needs a quick drink of water, now's the time to do it, because we are about to start with our second presentation, and we will then have a third one thereafter. So this next one is going to be presented to us by Antonia. And this is a piece of work that AlliedOffsets did for and with IETA to help inform our guidelines that I mentioned earlier. So really super piece of work, in my view anyway. And Antonia, over to you if you would do your presentation, please.
Great, thank you, Andrea, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joining today. So my name is Antonia Drummond. I am the carbon markets data lead at AlliedOffsets. For those of you who don't know us, we host the largest data set on voluntary carbon market projects. We cover 24 registries plus non-registered carbon dioxide removal projects, totaling almost 30,000 at the moment. And within that, we track project activity, including credit prices, buyer and intermediary activity, and market trends. So we were commissioned by IETA to do a piece of work to understand what the high integrity use case for carbon credits would be. So the purpose of this research, I think as we can all agree, there's an increasing need to understand how carbon offsetting can contribute to companies' overall decarbonization strategies. So the way that we approached this was first to understand just how much carbon dioxide are these companies emitting, what percentage of those emissions are covered by a reduction target, and what that might mean for the VCM. So the findings in this report, which I encourage you all to read, we're just going to go over a few of them briefly today, but it's meant to inform carbon market participants, sustainability officers, and policymakers to look at the potential for the voluntary market to help reduce and remove GHG emissions. So how did we approach this? The findings that I'm going to cover here are based off of our extrapolated data set. So this covers emissions estimates that we modeled for around 6,400 largest listed companies. So These companies represent $81 trillion of market cap and cover 73 countries. We estimated their emissions based off of our AlliedOffsets emissions data set. And we created a model to estimate company emissions based off of the type of organization that they were, so company sector, as well as the size of the organizations, looking at things like revenue and number of employees. As you can see here, the total emissions estimated for this data set is 88 gigatons of carbon dioxide, or the equivalents, 11 gigatons of which is scope 1 and 2 emissions. You can see here that their scope 3 emissions vastly outstrip total global emissions. And the reason that that is the case is because we did not, we counted emissions in the same way that companies are required to do their carbon accounting, which does not make adjustments for double, triple, quadruple counting. So just be aware of that as I'm discussing the findings. I think we'll focus a little bit more on scope 1 and 2 today anyway. And then the way that we then matched those companies to their net zero SBTi targets, and we modeled decarbonization pathways by estimating a 50% reduction by 2030 and a 90% reduction by 2050 for those with SBTi targets. And for anyone with net zero commitments, we just assumed a zero carbon scenario by 2050. If companies did not have a target, we just carried on their emissions from the baseline onward. Yeah, so Andrea mentioned earlier that all of this modeling is exactly that. It is modeling, and all modeling has limitations. So just going to touch on those briefly. The extrapolated data set that I'm going to be focusing on, as I mentioned, these are estimates of emissions based off of our sample data set. That sample data set accounts for around 22 gigatons of carbon dioxide, so approximately 25% of what we estimate to be extrapolated. Additionally, the pathways for decarbonization that we looked at are based off of a linear model, so going from the baseline to the target. In reality, decarbonization may occur at varying rates between now and when the targets were set. With all that being said, I think while no modeling can predict the future exactly, we do believe that this exercise is still pretty useful to understand challenges to global greenhouse gas reductions and then the potential role for the VCM to aid decarbonization. So I'm just going to go through some of the main findings of this report. I think probably the most important one to take home today is that the majority of the largest listed companies have not yet set climate targets. So we say that 81% of those exactly. So of the 11 gigatons, 7.5 of those scope 1 and 2 emissions are not covered by a climate target. So what does this mean in actuality or substantive terms? Unless more companies set targets, we believe that additional emissions above a Paris pathway could potentially reach 4 gigatons of scope 1 and 2 emissions alone by 2030 and 6 gigatons by 2050. So we think it's really, really important that companies increase ambition on climate and decarbonization. And that is just accounting for an assumption that these companies will actually hit the targets that they're setting. However, based off of our modeling, we think that even companies who have set targets are at risk of missing them. And that is particularly great for scope 3 emissions. So in order to calculate the likelihood of companies missing targets, we looked at our sample data set and the emissions that companies should be hitting to reach their targets by 2030 and 2050. We found on aggregate, these organizations were missing scope 1 and 2 targets by 26%, and that is in terms of emissions volume. Scope 3 emissions are on track to be missed by 62% annually. So that is quite significant. And that is going to be a risk even if all companies increase their climate ambition and set targets. So just looking at the companies who have set targets, We think that this could reach up to 4.5 gigatons of additional emissions by 2030. And as you can see in the table towards the bottom, that is primarily scope 3 emissions. So that is a significant risk. Then for the rest of this talk, I just want to focus on our modeling based off of on hard to abate sectors. So we built on work done by the Mission Possible Partnership to look at decarbonization trajectories for hard to abate sectors. So MPP defines those sectors as those relating to heavy industry and transport. So for this analysis, we applied those kind of scenarios to the hard to abate sectors within the extrapolated data set. And within that, we found that even in the best case scenarios, there is a somewhat significant gap between Paris-aligned decarbonization. So just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here, there are 3 scenarios that we looked at in terms of decarbonization. So the first one is business as usual, BAU, and this just assumes that all companies are going to continue making decisions that are economically advantageous without a big focus on decarbonization. The next one is a low cost scenario. So in this case, an internal carbon cost is brought into business decisions and readily available decarbonization technologies are used. The third one is what is considered to be a fastest abatement. And so this is like the best case scenario. And this assumes that additional sources of renewable energy will be made available and companies will be always using the best available technologies for decarbonization regardless of cost. And that may not always be feasible for every company. We then applied a Paris pathway on top of this. And you can see that even in this fastest abatement scenario, there is a gap between Paris decarbonization and likely decarbonization at 2030. Obviously, that gap is much greater for a low cost and business as usual scenario. So just to reiterate that hard to abate sectors are most likely going to find decarbonization the most difficult out of other companies in the market. And even in the best possible scenario, that could still lead to an emissions gap of 2.5 gigatons by 2030 and could potentially lead to something much greater. So just finally, as a conclusion, I want to bring back to the first point, which is that the most pressing concern right now is the number of companies that have not yet set any emissions targets. We don't ever want to be saying that carbon credits should be used as a substitute for decarbonization, but it is possible that they could lower the barrier for entry, make it a little bit less daunting to start engaging with decarbonization. Then in the case of missed targets, potentially if companies have done all feasible efforts to reduce their emissions, carbon credits could be used to mitigate excess emissions from missed targets or to help mitigate excess emissions. And I think that is particularly relevant when it comes to hard to abate sector and scope 3 emissions. So I think that is where I will leave you, and I will hand back to Andrea. I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're back.
Back. Yeah, sorry, I thought the sound went for a minute. Thank you very much, Antonia. So interesting to look at the risks, potential risks of corporates missing targets and the role that carbon markets could play in helping to ensure that doesn't happen. The number of companies who haven't set targets, I found that pretty alarming. And then I think also really super to be able to build on work that others have done, like the Mission Possible Partnership, and to take that data and sort of work with it to build some new perspectives on that. So really interesting work there. And this work is now live as of today. So again, it's available at that link that was provided at the start of the session. We're now moving on to the third presentation. So James, really looking forward to this final session from you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So my name is James Griffiths, and I lead the corporate data team at MSCI Carbon Markets. You might have heard of MSCI from our climate offering, and as carbon markets, we sit alongside and plug into that. Or you might know MSCI from their wider ESG offering or their heritage as an index and benchmark provider. But you also might know our team as Trove Research, which was our company name until the end of last year when we were acquired by MSCI. Is the sound okay, by the way, guys? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Our mission is, oh, thanks, loads of thumbs up. Our mission is to provide investment quality data across the carbon market space. So that goes from those on the supply side, developers, traders, those on the demand side, particularly corporates and sustainability teams, and importantly, the community of investors and asset managers that sit around the space. Even as Trove standalone last year, I think something we did really well was a very wide offering. I won't read through all of this, but to just call out a few things. We offer integrity assessments of carbon credit projects. We've got pricing data. We've got forecast and pricing and market sizes. Our policy team synthesizes the complex guidance in this area. And of course, we track the corporate data, emissions, targets, credit use, forecasts, and so on. Now, as part of MSCI, we also sit alongside an even wider climate offering. Our coverage universe, which I'll go on to talk about, is even bigger. There's physical risk, there's assessment of transition risks and opportunities, and we've got access to lots of financial data as well for corporates. So really big base of information to draw on. As part of that work, we produced research, some of which is public facing. A few of the, I guess, the most prominent ones from last year were the emissions, mission performance versus credits, which Stephen discussed very graciously, thank you. A survey we did into investment and capital flows in the carbon market. We looked at CCPs and their impact on the market. And what we're going to talk about today is some work we did for VCMI around the impact of using carbon credits alongside target setting. All of these reports are available on our website, by the way, troveresearch.com, and we do public-facing webinars, which are very well attended. Next one, 23rd of But drawing on all of that, the work we did for VCMI was effectively investigating the potential climate outcomes of using carbon credits as a tool alongside decarbonisation. And as we've heard from some of the previous reports, there's a lot of evidence which suggests this could generate good outcomes. We try to take a different approach to this. The first is to quantify the gap between emissions and companies' targets. Secondly, we looked at what the market dynamics might be of allowing credits to be used in this way, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail. Then we calculated the outcomes of these things, putting them together to sort of quantifiable results in financial and credit terms. And this work was used by VCMI to inform their Scope 3 flexibility claim. And I'll mention that at the end. Takeaway from this is that what we found is using or allowing carbon credits to be part of the mitigation hierarchy alongside complementing decarbonisation can lower the overall cost of action, and that can drive companies to set more ambitious targets and lead to greater overall decarbonisation. So how do we get there? The first thing is we drew on our universe, we call it, universe of company coverage. I think one thing that all of us who work in this space and do research are quite conscious of is there's always a risk of implicit bias in the sets of companies we cover. As Trove even, we try to take a very broad set of companies, so there's 10,000 or so that went into this research. As MSCI, that's grown even wider, probably more than 15,000 companies now. Our universe is built in a few different ways. Firstly, with MSCI's heritage as an index provider, we look at the largest publicly listed companies. In particular, something called the MSCI ACWI IMI, the All Country World Index Investable Markets. There's a large number of companies there, as well as various fixed income providers and so on. So, huge number of companies. They may or may not set targets or be involved in the VCM. Thanks. So we've got a load of publicly listed companies that we've collected data on. We also have companies who signed up to SBTI, of course. Many of those are the same publicly listed companies, but some of them are smaller or private companies. And then indeed, we look at private companies in and of themselves. There's clearly a lot of interest in the role that privates can play in the transition. And across this set, as I say, companies may or may not be involved in VCM, may or may not be involved, may or may not set targets. So huge universe here. And then data sets which were relevant to this research were, firstly, we've got emissions data. And one of the things we did as Trove and we do as MSCI is we have large teams of people who do the work of trawling through company reports and sustainability reports and pulling out all of those disclosed emissions. We've got estimation models as well. We've got AI layers that do some of this work, but importantly for working out this gap, our analysis was based on the disclosed company emissions. So baseline year, scopes 1, 2, and 3 as disclosed across a 5-6 year history. We collect company targets as well, net zeros targets, which might be SBTI aligned, Paris aligned, but they might be self-declared targets. We look at the depth of that, and emission reduction targets as well. So all of that fed into this report. We capture renewable energy targets and carbon neutral claims, and we of course look at corporate credit use, doing that hard work Stephen described of cleaning up and matching registries, pulling various sources. This was based on emissions and targets. So first thing, quantifying the gap between emissions and targets. I always like a diagram just to explain conceptually what we did. For each company in the universe, we took their baseline emissions and their baseline year. And we looked firstly at their latest disclosures. And we looked at their actual disclosed emissions. And we plotted where this company should be if it were on its path to hitting its target. And we looked at the over or underperformance, if you will, against that. And here there's a gap as shown by the orange line. And we also did the same thing with science-based targets. Let's see if I can hear you.
Don't know, is this any better or worse, my microphone? Just getting some comments that you can't hear me very well. Better, okay, right. Ooh, thanks. Right, sorry for that. Okay, so we've got the gap between emissions and targets, and also we worked out where a company would be if it were on a Paris-aligned pathway. And from there, we projected forwards to 2030. So take these numbers with a pinch of salt, of course, but assuming that nothing changed and companies continued at the same rate, we could look at the size of the gap between emissions and targets at 2030. And we applied this across all of the companies in our universe where we could do so. We looked at this for scope 1 and 2, for scope 3, their own targets, Paris-aligned pathways, now and in the future. And I won't go into all the details, you can find those in our report. But just to summarize here, looking today at the gap between emissions and targets, for scopes 1 and 2, we found 400 megatons of gap, which could grow to 2 gigatons by 2030. And for scope 3, importantly, put a mental pin in this one, so we'll come back to it, 1.3 gigatons of gap between emissions and targets, own targets, growing to potentially 7 gigatons by 2030. Nothing changed. So that's one size, was sizing the gap. The other part of what we did was to model how the use of carbon credits to close that gap might inspire more climate action. And I thought this was a really interesting piece of research here. I think intuitively, we all know or understand that where decarbonisation is more difficult and more expensive, in those sectors, we tend to see lower climate ambition. And therefore, if decarbonisation were cheaper, we might be able to expect more action from companies. And certainly anecdotally, in some of the surveys like what Stephen mentioned, companies are saying that they see carbon credits as being part of this toolkit. But I don't think anyone had ever tried to quantify this before. So kudos to our MD, Guy Turner, dusted off his old behavioural economics hat, and we tried to look at this problem. The graph on the right sort of demonstrates how we thought of it. Working with various parties, partners and various academic sources, we tried to find costs of abatement for different sectors and industries. And for each sector, we compared that cost of abatement against 3 different measures of climate ambition. The first, and probably most simple, I suppose, was the number of companies setting SBTI targets. We can count that. More interestingly and accurately, we looked for each sector at the percentage of global market cap for that sector who is now under SBTI. And that's something we could do with all the financial information we have as MSCI. And I think that's a really important statistic. And the other thing we looked at was what's called the implied temperature rise. For those of you who don't know that term, it's something, a metric which MSCI originated, that's now in use generally across the industry. And that it effectively says, looking at a particular company, if every company in the world behaved like this one in terms of its targets, what would happen to the global temperature? So again, a really interesting metric there. It cuts through a lot of the complexity of having different time periods and different reductions and different scopes, and has something to compare against between companies. And I guess, as you can see, there is a clear relation, as you see on the right, and we could quantify that. So putting those things together, we know the gap, particularly for scope 3. We know the cost to close that gap. We know, therefore, how much the mitigation cost would be reduced, because obviously, carbon credits in general are cheaper than decarbonisation, so lower blended cost for a company. And we know how target setting might be related to this reducing cost. The results I'm about to show you, we crunched various models. But in particular here, this is looking only at companies who have signed up to SBTI. They've set targets across scopes 1, 2, and 3. They're on track with meeting their scope 1 and 2 targets. These are companies who are generally showing and delivering on climate ambition, but struggling with scope 3. So it's a subset of our universe. But even for these companies, if we could allow them to close the gap between their emissions and the scope 3 targets, we could see up to 640 megatons of carbon credits being used today. And that, using high quality carbon credits, even the more expensive end of carbon credits, would equate to $19 billion of carbon credit, of finance into this space. And on the modeling side, this approach could lead to, and take this with a pinch of salt, because it's a model, but 1,000 companies setting targets, 10 trillion in market capital. 400 of those targets we think could be SBTI approved. And the impact on the global temperature rise could be a decrease of 0.5 degrees C. So, as I say, and as Andrea warned, this is only a model. There's lots of complexities, moving this from theory to practice. But certainly it frames the opportunity here, and it shows there's a lot of potential to be had in allowing carbon credits into the decarbonisation approach in a thoughtful way. And just very quickly to finish, this is something that we did for VCMI, and it fed into the launch of their Scope 3 flexibility claim, which was published towards the end of last year. It embodies a lot of the ideas I've discussed in this quick presentation, along with other factors around carbon credit use. So VCMI, for example, require high integrity credits, CCPs, CCP eligible credits. They need or require that a company is making this claim meet their foundational criteria of disclosing third-party verification and so on. This flexibility claim is now being tested by the VCMI with a group of participants. We were very happy to use our wide data set to support this. Excited to do some innovative work here to help their thinking, and look forward to seeing how that develops over time. I welcome any questions in the chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James. Super, really super presentation. So we've covered the correlation between corporate decarbonisation and use of carbon markets. We've looked at the potential risks of corporates missing targets, and if you project that forward, what the consequences could be, the challenges for hard-to-abate sectors, the quantification and understanding of the risk of emission gaps, the risk of the cost of mitigation and the issue of affordability of decarbonisation, how the increased use of carbon credits can lead to increased finance, and of course the potential impact to help reduce global warming. So wide spectrum of outputs that these various modelling studies have looked at. We're now going to move into some questions and answers. We've got a couple of questions that have come through on the chat, so I'm going to start with those. But if anyone would like to put your hand up, please do that, and the team helping man in the background, woman in the background, will take you off mute, and we can take your questions. So let me go to the first one, and I think, Stephen, I'm going to turn to you with this one. Aside from VCMI claims code and Scope 3 flexibility claim, please share your perspectives on the incentives and levers that are most likely to incentivize corporates to engage with the voluntary carbon market and de-risk their purchase of carbon credits. I think in the study you covered, and certainly in the ecosystem marketplace, what incentivizes corporate action was something you covered.
Yeah, well, I think it's also looking at, what has been clearly stated as the disincentives, and that goes back to the report that just got published from We Mean Business, Bain, and Intercontinental Exchange. And it's clear there that there's a need for recognition. The recognition coming not just from being able to have a standard or guidance framework that clearly states how a company can claim the credits, but also that the civil society and the media are informed and understand, how those claims are being made and how it fits within the broader context of a corporate strategy to tackle, climate change. And then the other two pieces of that are also, related to clarity, which is how it fits within the broader carbon accounting process for a corporation. And that I think is where, we've heard time and time again calls for the GHG protocol, which is the most widely used, standard for corporate quantification of greenhouse gas emissions of Scope 1, 2, and 3, where years ago they allowed for renewable energy certificates to be a tool to net out Scope 2 emissions. That there have been similar calls for being able to have carbon credits be a way that companies can net out some of their emissions. And then the last is the more kind of standardization and kind of global recognition about project quality, transparency. So these are all kind of risk factors if they're not solved, because they open up companies for ambiguity in their purchasing and ambiguity in their claims as well as their accounting. And the less or the more that ambiguity can be solved, I think that's what we're hearing are the top reasons, for companies to engage.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next one so we get a couple of questions in. And I think, Mark, I'll come to you with this one. It's a question on scale and ambition. What do you say to the argument that reporting frameworks like the GHG protocol and ISSB disclosures do not allow for netting of inventory emissions with credits, and hence there isn't a real incentive for companies to use credits?
Thank you. I think that sort of also cuts across what Stephen was just saying. Look, I think if the question of netting, by that the questioner means that not all emissions reductions or all emissions are treated as equal, I think that is going to continue to be the case. And actually, I would argue that that's a useful thing, because we want transparency and we want full disclosure on what companies are doing. And so we want to see what their emissions are, we want to see how they're reducing their emissions, and we want to see what their investments in carbon markets and other instruments look like. I think the question is not so much about the accounting, although we do need accounting systems, and Stephen's just alluded to this, which allow companies to both report, well, to count, report, and disclose what they're doing in a way that we, the public, can understand, scrutinize, challenge, and reward, if whatever the case is. I think more of the challenge is about the rules or assumptions about how and when companies can use carbon credits as part of their net zero transition strategies. And we know that there are some pretty divided views in the world. There are those who believe that any use in carbon credits will almost automatically or axiomatically be substituted for corporate decarbonization. And in as much as we want the technology development and deployment that tough targets for companies drive, we don't want to diminish that. And then there are others who say, well, that doesn't make sense, because if we can have all emissions reductions and removals at the lowest possible cost using markets, that frees up cash that can then be invested in technology development and so on. So both those positions, I believe, are broadly ideologically driven and not necessarily backed up by the evidence. There is a lot of evidence that we've heard today that shows, on the one hand, companies that are using carbon credits are those that are decarbonizing more, are those that are setting tougher targets and are taking it more seriously. But at the same time, we know that for some companies, they have a fixed budget and therefore would not want to take money away from R&D expenditures to invest outside their value chains. And that is perfectly legitimate too. There are some emissions which are certainly reducible and others that probably are not reducible, and therefore it makes sense to compensate them by using carbon credits. So I think we need to get into a more nuanced discussion about this. I think there is clearly a case, and looking at one of the other questions, there is a case for companies to use carbon credits as part of their net zero transitions, not only as a CSR or a philanthropic gesture, but part of their mainstream investments. But we do need to make sure that it's done in a way, and I go back to the question I asked at the beginning, how do we incentivize deep decarbonization by companies and also deep investments in voluntary carbon markets in a way that those complement each other? And I think we've seen some examples and reasons why that will be the case. So to drive that, we need to have broader acceptance of the role that carbon credits can play in those corporate transitions. We need to have accounting, which allows those to be disclosed and reported. And we need to have other kinds of incentives. Now, one obvious one might be, if all companies, and this is not my idea, but if all companies had their carbon emissions or their GHG emissions were recorded as liability on their balance sheets, then suddenly there would be an incentive to deal with them more than there is today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to stick on the use cases for credits, and Antonia, come to you with the next one, and then James, I've got a follow-up question for you. So the question is, these are great results and suggestions. Thank you for the research. However, while IETA is calling on corporates to use carbon credits towards closing the gap between their targets and where they should be, there is no guidance really that allows for the use of credits towards targets besides the flexibility claim. There's no incentive for corporates to get involved, only reputational risk. How do we overcome that? So how can we use credits towards closing the gap and avoid reputational risk?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think what I'm hearing a lot in the space is the key is high integrity. I think these are some buzzwords that have been thrown around a lot, but I think it's really important that we as a space converge in what is a high integrity credit, what is considered good quality, because I think that is one of the biggest barriers for companies who are worried about actually getting burned for offsetting in the wrong way, for example. So yeah, what I've been hearing in the space is that a lot of companies are waiting for the CCP labels. We can see some kind of early stage demand from CORSIA phase 1 credits, for example, because that is somewhat of an indication of quality that spans across registries. And then I think also we're seeing more and more compliance schemes start allowing the use of specific types of credits towards compliance requirements. And so again, those usually go through additional quality checks or have specific like location reasons why, you know, for example, in South Africa and in Colombia, oftentimes the projects need to be based in those countries, and there are certain registries that are allowed to deliver those offsets and others that are not.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess also the need to disclosure and report,
Absolutely, yes.
of course, another key one. James, I've got a few for you. I'm going to add them together, and then we're going to move on to our summary statement. So do hang on a few minutes while we finish off on these questions. So given MSCI's findings, is VCMI considering allowing credits for scope 1 and 2 more than is currently allowed? I'm sure Mark may want to chip in on that one. And then there was a specific question on your model and how you avoid double counting in your model.
Yeah.
There's lots more, but let's start with those two.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll talk about double counting. For anyone who doesn't know that term, I guess the idea here is that one company's scope 1 and 2 is another company's scope 3. I guess implicitly, whenever you start adding up scope 3s, you're double counting the same emissions over and over potentially. And actually for this research, I don't think we needed to even account for that. It's sort of implicit and intrinsic, but what we're looking at here is each company's own gap between their emissions and their targets. And I think this speaks to the thing everyone, I think, agrees on. Decarbonisation must be the focus. Bringing down the underlying emissions is the main thing we're trying to do. But by bringing in credits to bridge that gap, we show that it can be cheaper for companies to stay on track with their targets. And if it's cheaper, more companies might take action. So I think that's the point on double counting. And with regards, I don't want to speak on Mark's behalf. So, you know, yeah, would VCMI consider other things? I guess that's sort of the point of what's being discussed here, is trying to think of ways to incentivize more action and do that in a thoughtful and considered way that drives the right results. Mark, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, look, as I said before, the use of carbon credits as part of decarbonisation journeys is a politically sensitive subject, and you know there are strong views on either side. We published the beta version of the Scope 3 flexibility claim before COP28 last year, based in large part on work that James and Guy and colleagues at MSCI Trove did, which showed that there is a big gap to be filled. That at the moment companies don't face any sanction for being off track with their targets or not meeting their targets. They're voluntary after all, and we believe that, you know, provided companies are making meaningfully their best efforts to reach their targets, if they cannot do so, and there are often decent reasons why they can't at any given moment, they should fill that gap with carbon credits. Now, what the right percentages are, how you measure companies' trajectories from where they are now to some 2030 target, how you measure how far off track they are, what the gap is, those are all things that we need to work out. So there are still a lot of technical questions to be resolved to make sure that, and I go back to the question I keep repeating, that the use of carbon credits incentivizes further decarbonisation rather than being a substitute or a brake for it. So we're testing the Scope 3 flexibility, this claim. We're working with a large number of companies to work it through, understand if there are sectoral differences or difference in types of emissions and how those should be addressed, what the percentages, what the guardrails should be. And we hope later in this year to publish an updated version that can be used by companies to make claims. Looking at Scope 1 and 2, there clearly companies that have targets are doing better on Scope 1 and 2, but many are off track. I think if, depending on what sort of feedback we get on the Scope 3 claim, we would certainly be open to examining the possibility of whether flexibility is reasonable and how it could be applied to Scopes 1 and 2, but there's no decision on that yet. But there are also a large number of companies that are probably not able to make any of those kind of claims yet. That, you know, we talk about, I think there were, I looked up last week, there are 335 million companies in the world, and we're talking about the top few thousands. The vast majority of those companies probably don't even know they're supposed to be doing anything, and if they are, they're in no way able to start going deep decarbonization and going beyond that. So what do we need to do to encourage those companies to be part of this conversation? What do they need to do to start probably measuring their carbon footprints? Are there ways that we can start recognizing their efforts and bring them into the fold? So we, along with others, are keen to look at that, because this is about what we're doing, and I think all the others on this call, this webinar would agree. We're looking at ways to encourage more action more quickly, and we need to do that in a way that generates more overall mitigation, and we believe that the evidence suggests we can do so, but we need to make sure we get it right.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we absolutely need carbon markets to be a tool in the corporate toolbox, and we do work together. We don't always agree on everything from the start, but we all agree, I think, on the overall role that carbon markets needs to play and the need to increase ambition. So I'm going to move now on to a piece of work, as I mentioned at the start, that we have all put our heads together on, just to try and draw out of all the discussion that we've had today. It's been a lot of data, to just draw out some key facts from this work that we kind of all align on. And so I'm going to pass now to Mark, who's going to take you through our summary statement, we've called it, from the panel today. So Mark.
Thank you.
The slide, please.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So, and also thanks to all of those who presented on today's webinar. I mean, what you're about to talk through is a very high-level summary of all their very deep and very important work. So just to go through these points, and I'm going to read them out because they're important. We have what's in black font is a summary of the facts, and then in blue in italics is what we as collectively believe are the resulting actions that need to be taken from the evidence that we've heard today. So first and foremost, still around 80% of the world's largest listed companies have not yet set Paris-aligned targets. And this is not talking about those 335 million companies that I mentioned a few moments ago. These are the large companies listed on stock exchanges around the world, large market capitalization, who have no reason or no excuse not to be aware of the imperative of climate action or the need for them to be part of that decarbonization journey. So only 20% of these companies currently have Paris-aligned targets. And if we just take that 20% that do have Paris-aligned targets, even if we only talk about Scope 1 and 2 emissions, if we took those companies that 80% don't have targets, if they took on targets and met those targets, we would be able to reduce emissions over the next 6 years by a further 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And to put that in context, that's around 8% of global emissions. So just that alone, those companies that don't yet have targets, take on targets, we get another 8% reduction in global emissions. And so given those two facts, point one, that few companies have those targets and the amount of emissions that we reduce, first obvious request is that all companies should set Paris-aligned reduction targets as quickly as possible. As I mentioned in the introduction, emissions have not yet peaked. We are still seeing emissions grow, and they were likely to be 3% higher than at the time of Paris by 2030. If we want to get to that 42% reduction, these companies need to get on the journey and reduce and set ambitious emission reductions targets. But then if we take those that do have net zero emission pathways and as Paris-aligned targets, even their Scope 1 and 2 emissions have on average been around 19% higher than a Paris-aligned pathway. So we've got a large chunk who are not doing anything, not taking on targets, but even those who have taken on targets are not on track to meet them. And if they carry on on the same trajectory, as to say 19% off track, that creates an emissions gap of 1.5 to 2 gigatons. Again, that's about 3 to 4% of global emissions, which would be reduced if those companies with targets were actually to meet them. So as a result of that, we encourage not only the companies who haven't got targets to take on targets, but those who have to get on their pathways aligned with the Paris objectives of 1.5 and well under 2 degrees. Apply the mitigation hierarchy. Every speaker on this webinar has talked about the importance of prioritizing decarbonisation, but then where there is a gap to be filled, not to just shrug your shoulders and go, sorry, couldn't do it. Use carbon credits, use high carbon quality credits to bridge that gap and compensate for the emissions that you could or should perhaps have been reducing. And then we move to Scope 3. We know that some companies having troubles with Scope 1 and 2. With Scope 3, the picture is much bleaker. Up to 60%. That's over half of all companies with Scope 3 emission reduction targets. And remember, this is a very small subset of the universe of total listed companies. Of those companies that have targets, over 60%, around 60%, are off track with meeting them. Even if we just take a limited set, and this is what James was talking to, those companies that have targets that are on track with their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which suggests that they are on track to meet their 2030 targets. We take those and look at their gap for their Scope 3 emissions. If that gap was filled with high integrity carbon credits, it could create a demand of 640 megatons of CO2e today. Now, remember early figures, the current market is about 200 to 250 million tons a year. So we would probably triple the size of the market if we required those companies, or those companies decided to fill their gaps with high quality carbon credits, and in addition, generate an extra $19 billion of finance. Therefore, an obvious urging from that is that companies should set Scope 3 targets, not only those who have no targets at all, but those who have just set Scope 1 and 2 targets, make every best effort to achieve them, and then use high integrity carbon credits to close the gap. We've also seen across all the studies we've heard today, the companies that are engaging with carbon markets are doing better. They're reducing their emissions more quickly. They're setting more ambitious targets. They're more likely to have targets that cover Scopes 1, 2, and 3, and they're more likely to deal at higher levels in the organization with their climate responsibilities. And in particular, putting a price on carbon is a driver to more decarbonisation and use of carbon credits. So as a final point, we urge all companies to put a price on carbon and use the VCM to increase climate ambition. So in summary, those are the summary points from today's webinar and the research that we've presented. The key finding, I think, overall is that it seems that it's possible to drive deep decarbonisation, which we clearly need, and much deeper, greater investment in voluntary carbon markets. So it's not either or it's both and not only is both and possible, both and is necessary. So we need to get on with it.
Thank you very much, Mark. That statement that those shared findings are now live on the link is in the chat, both the statement as well as some social posts in LinkedIn and elsewhere. The statement, of course, has a number of footnotes and references, and they're all accessible in the full statement. So great if you can share your thoughts on that statement. We'd love to hear from you. Just to close off for today, I wanted to remind people that IETA is having a climate summit. It is the European Climate Summit, and that will be in Florence from the 16th to 18th of April. At that conference, we will be launching our IETA guidelines that I've spoken about today, as well as holding a voluntary carbon market plenary discussion on those, as well as other guidelines to look at, again, how we move forward with, as Mark says, doing both decarbonising and using carbon markets. A reminder that there is a recording of this webinar. It will be available in a day or two's time. And on that note, thank you very much to all the panel for collaborating on this and for continuing to work together. We all have an absolute shared mission and a shared passion to drive this market, and it's really great to work with you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. We've had fantastic numbers, and it's really good to hear from you. Thank you for your questions, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.